Hey guys, Lynn Burke here, owner of Blues City Music in Memphis, Tennessee. Thanks for stopping by. Today we're off-site, like we routinely do, whether it's LA, whether it's Nashville. Today we're in Seattle, Washington with my good bud Mike Soldano. And we appreciate Mikey having us in there today. Thank you so much. And so the good thing about this is we've had a great visit today, taking a look at all the amps, which we're going to go into detail on in another video behind us that are part of the museum. But we're also talking about where the company started, how it's morphed into the move to Los Angeles, back to Seattle, and where some of the new products are going today. So I'm going to let Mikey kind of talk about the history of Soldano and give you a little bit more of a personal feeling to you guys out there, let you know, sure, these amps are played by major manufacturers, major label players all over the globe, studios from the East Coast to West Coast. I've got 5 in our studio, as a matter of fact, but they're also made for anybody that's playing, whether you're a brand new player that just wants good quality gear, and it's an heirloom piece. It's a good quality piece of equipment that'll last you a lifetime. So with that, I'm going to let Mikey take it and tell us about Soldano, and we'll go from there.
All right. Thanks, Lynn. Thank you. So anyway, yeah, where it started. Okay, I've been building amps for a little over 30 years. And it all started, I was originally building guitars, and that came out of just the need. It was like, necessity is the mother of invention. So growing up fairly financially challenged, we'll say, if I wanted good stuff, I generally had to learn how to make it myself because I couldn't buy major brand good stuff. So anyway, started building guitars. I was pursuing hopefully a musical career. I wanted to be a guitar player. I was looking for my tone, and I wasn't finding it, so I figured, well, I'll build a better guitar and I'll sound better. Then I realized the real weak link in the whole thing is the amplifier. Sure. You can have a great guitar, and if you don't have a great amp, it's not going to sound good. So I taught myself electronics, and I learned how amps work that way. Vacuum tubes electronics that's, sure. I was reading all these old 1940s radio manuals to learn this stuff. Sure. And so I learned basically how to work with tubes and what tubes are all about. And of course, my real pursuit was, though, still to be a player. So by this time, I had landed a decent job in an auto body shop, saved up my money, and after 2 years of saving, I was able to buy a Mesa Boogie Mark II. So I thought that was going to be, okay, I don't really need to know this electronic stuff. I've got a good amp. I'm going to be off and running. But the Mark II, as good of an amp as it was, it had some shortcomings. One thing that really bugged me was that you did not have individual preamps. In other words, one preamp relied on the other to get its sound. So if you had a really good clean sound, you couldn't get enough overdrive. If you had a good overdrive, sure, the clean suffered. The EQ didn't work right. I mean, there was a lot of things I didn't like about it. And this was like $1,455. I remember that number in my head. In 1980, that was a lot of money. So I decided there's probably a better solution. And that's when I really put my head to learning how to design amps. And the result of that was this guy over here, which is Mr. Science, which later became the very first SLO 100. Wow. And my idea there was 2 independent preamps that were in parallel with each other rather than in series, and this would all be great. So I built that amp really just for myself. I had no intention of ever doing this as a living. And the interesting thing, though, was that every time I took it down to my friend's rehearsal hall to test it, whenever we plugged that thing in and started playing it, all the guitar players in the building would flock to this room to see what we were playing through. They were like, oh, my God, what is that, And so people would tell me, like, well, if you ever built those, I'd buy one. And I was kind of starting to think, well, I'm starting to push 30, and I haven't become a rock star yet. Maybe I need an alternate career. So I was thinking, like, well, maybe this amp thing could have some roots, it could do something. So basically, long story short, I decided to put more effort into the amp design thing and maybe build some for these guys that mentioned they wanted some. Well, unfortunately, not unfortunately, but I built 3 amps with the idea that there were these 3 particular guys in Seattle that were going to buy these from me. As a result, at the end of the day, only one of my friends bought one. My friend Tommy Martin, who still owns serial number 001 to this day. He bought one, but then I had these other 2 amps. I'm thinking, like, well, now what do I do? So I put an ad in the back of Guitar World magazine, you know, like, hey, Soldano Custom Amplification, or Soldano Guitars. I was still building guitars at the time.
Oh, wow.
So Soldano Guitars is now offering this new amplifier, right? And it was one of those tiny little ads that you took out in the back that cost like, you know, $30 or whatever. Well, I got a few guys that sent me letters. This is way before the internet, way before fax machines, way before anything. So, you know, a few guys wrote me, and I wrote back and sent them pictures of the amp and a description. But I never generated any sales. So finally, I got the idea that I needed to be really more where the musicians were. And the grunge thing hadn't happened yet in Seattle, so there wasn't much going on here from, you know, guitar greatness in Seattle. Even though they were great players, nobody knew about us. So I'm like, I got to go where the studios are. So in the winter of 1987, I was sitting at my job at the body shop. And this shop, by the way, was unheated. So every winter was really a misery working there. And 87, I was like, you know what? I'm tired of doing this freezing cold job every winter. I'm going to do something different. So I took a big leap, and I packed my SLOs I had and some belongings and some other stuff in the trunk of my 38 Chevy, and I drove to Los Angeles and camped out with a cousin of mine for a couple months with the idea that I would start a guitar shop in Los Angeles. I finally landed a little 700 square foot shop on Melrose Avenue in Hollywood, not the trendy part of Melrose, the more kind of not so great part of Melrose. Put up a sign, and at that time I decided to, when I got to LA, I realized everybody and their brother was a luthier, so the guitar biz was not going to be my main push. I was going to lean on the amp strengths I had. So I launched Soldano Custom Amplification on April Fool's Day, 1987. That was my first day of business, April 1, 1987.
Wow.
And I took this little shop, which was used to be an Oriental massage parlor, and I converted it into a guitar shop, or an amp shop, and I was right next door to Bob Roberts' Spotlight Tattoo, and it was awesome, right? So I started this business and basically starved for a year, doing odd jobs, whatever I could, just to, you know, keep paying the rent and hope that I'd get the interest of somebody. Luckily, within the first several months, I met Howard Lease at the Rainbow Bar and Grill on Sunset, and I sold him amp number 2. I introduced myself at a table. He says, hey, we're in town. We're recording out at Rumbo Recorders in Canoga Park. Here's the address. Why don't you bring this thing out and show it to me tomorrow? So I ran out there. He liked it. He bought it. You know, he jumped in his red Porsche, drove to Malibu, got me a check, drove back. Meanwhile, I was having barbecue with Ann and Nancy, and it was all good. And that was the beginning. That was my first celebrity sale. And then later, a kid I met down there, a guy named Tony, or Anthony, he got an amp in the hands of Steve Lukather from Toto.
Sure.
And Steve, of course, started talking to the studio grapevine of LA, and within several weeks, all of a sudden, everybody had to know about this amp. And things still hadn't taken off, but it was getting better.
Were you still showing Mr. Science then, or were these finished?
These were finished amps. Yeah, I still had Mr. Science, which later played a big role in the rental scene in LA, because when things finally popped and I started selling amps, I couldn't build them fast enough. So when somebody needed an amp for a recording session, I would let them borrow Mr. Science while I was building their actual amp.
Oh, sure.
So this amp's actually been around the world. It's been to Japan twice with Charlie Sexton. It's been everywhere, and it's been on 1 million records. So it's been on some, you know, it was used by Michael Landau. It was used by quite a few people. Mark Knopfler played it. Peter Frampton. I mean, it's got a pretty good history. It's seen more of the world than I have, that's for sure. And so anyway, so like I say, though, it still was kind of rocky. So things were still no money was coming in. That was what was hurting. And so by winter of 87, so going into 88, I thought, well, I've given this a year. It's really not working out. Probably going to have to go back to Seattle with my, you know, tail between my legs and go back to work at hammering fenders out on Toyotas, you know. But I got another little gig I was a roadie for Vixen for about a week, the all-girl metal band. Yeah. And so I came back really late one night from a gig, you know, schlepping gear all over the place. And so it's about 4 a.m, and the light's blinking on my phone machine, and I normally would just ignore that and not bother, even dealing with it till the morning. But for some reason, I really felt compelled to check my machine. And there were 3 messages on there. One was from Vivian Campbell, one was from Mike Landau, and one was from Lou Reed. Oh, wow. And I'm like, oh my God. Well, I wake up the next morning, and at first I thought the Lou Reed one was my friend Andy Brower, who had a studio rental place down there in Cartage Company. Right. I thought he was playing a joke on me, and because he would often do that. He'd call up and pretend he was some record label, and we want to buy a bunch of those amps, and he would just totally bust me up and laughing. Right. So at first I thought it was a joke, but then I realized it was a 212 area code, which is New York, which is where Lou Reed happens to live. So I called this guy, and sure enough, I'm talking to Lou Reed, wow. And he had heard about my amps through John Sir, who at the time was building his guitars, and John was also building Mark Knopfler's guitars, and Mark had been telling John about this amp. And so it's like I say, it's kind of this grapevine, and I think Bob Bradshaw had also been telling John about this amp. So all of a sudden, all these people are hearing about this amp. And sure enough, I ended up building an SLO for Lou, which was later followed by many, many Soldanos. Lou Reed was one of my largest customers and a great friend, and we do dearly miss him now. And then Vivian Campbell had me build him some custom-built rack mount SLOs. He got the very first of the rack mount SLOs. In fact, it was his desire for that motivated me to design a rack mount chassis. And so he had the first ones, and then it just started snowballing from there. And then pretty soon Andy Brower reviewed an SLO for Guitar World magazine in his gear column he did. And all of a sudden I went from 0 to 60 like in just seconds. I mean, it was just by that spring, the spring of '88, I was back ordered 6 months. And at that time I called my friend Bill Sant, who was living back in New Mexico, and said, hey, Bill, can you come out and help me out? I need somebody to help me build some amps. And so he came out and never went back. So, that's right. And so, we just got it going. And all of a sudden, my little shop in Hollywood was cranking out SLOs. At that point, Bob Bradshaw asked me to design a preamp, which I came up with the X88 3-channel preamp, which was originally built for Steve Lukather, because they wanted to build a preamp for Luke's rig. So Luke actually has the prototype of that. I mean, I don't know if he still has it, but he did have that. And then things just kept escalating, and pretty soon I built amps for Eric Clapton, Mark Knopfler, as I mentioned earlier. Many of the metal bands that were popular in LA at the time, Warren DeMartini, George Lynch, all these cats. It was really a remarkable time, and we were off and going, and it was all basically based on one head and one preamp. That's all I had to offer. Well, and then the rack mount. That was it right then? That was it. Yeah, there was nothing else. And then later, and at the same time, we were doing a lot of Marshall mods, because I had a really kick-ass mod I'd come up with for JMP Marshall, so we were doing a bunch of those. And so things just kind of kept taking off and getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And pretty soon I realized I needed a consumer-priced amp, something that had the tone of a Soldano, but not as expensive as an SLO, something that an entry-level player could get into. Because I was modding so many Marshalls that it got to the point to where people were calling me up asking me what Marshall to buy to mod. In other words, they didn't even own the Marshall yet. And I'm thinking to myself, like, well, if you're going out and buying an amp and then paying me to mod it, why don't I just provide an amp that's already modded, and you just come to me and buy the whole thing, and you aren't starting with a used amp? Right. And that was the birth of the Hot Rod 50, which originally was called the Super Lead 60. And those original Super Lead 60s were actually made in Japan, because my distributor in Japan at the time had made the claim that he could manufacture them for me for a better price to help me get to that consumer price point. And he was right in a way, except that by the time I paid the shipping and everything, I found that I could make them for the same price in the U.S. And so when I started making them in my own shop, that's when I changed the name to the Hot Rod 50. And that was the beginning of the Hot Rod series, which then later launched the 50 plus, the 100 plus. At that time, I needed a combo as well, so I came up with the Reverbo Sonic.
Sure.
And then I think the next product after the Reverbo Sonic was a pet project of mine, which was the Surf Box. I always wanted a spring reverb tremolo unit because I'm really into surf guitar music. So then was the Surf Box. And then about that time is when, so this is years going by here. So now we're up into the early 90s.
Right.
And by the mid 90s, I was sort of getting a little tired of living in LA. My shop had grown quite a bit. At one time, I had 8 employees, which was kind of a headache, honestly. But more so, my little sister was starting her family, and I wanted to see my niece and nephew grow up. So I moved back to Seattle. Yeah. So that's why I moved back to Seattle. So '94, packed up all the stuff in LA, hauled ass back up to Seattle, and then we just kept going here. And upon the return to Seattle, I first designed the Atomic 16. That was supposed to be my little idea of a practice amp. Yeah. That morphed into the Astroverb 16 because I added reverb to it at people's asking. And that amp's still one of our great little sellers to this day. And then moving into the late 90s, the Avengers came along because there was a need for a real high-gain, drop-tuned, pure rock amp for all the new drop tunings and the heavier sound that the metal stuff was going in. And then Lucky 13 came along in the early 2000s because I hadn't really addressed the clean amp sound yet. And and again, being kind of passionate about surf music, I figured it was time to have something that had a really kick-ass clean channel. And so the other thing was I noticed going to clubs that a lot of players were either playing Fender Twins or JMP Marshalls. And if they had a JMP Marshall, they usually had a pedal in front of it. So I'm thinking the perfect amp then would be a Twin and a modified Marshall, sure, all in one amp. Sure. And that's where the Lucky 13 came from. Sure. It's like clean channel, Fender Twin. Second channel, hot rodded Marshall. Sure. And it worked pretty good product. So then we moved along, and then I don't even remember what year it was, but you and I developed the 44. Right. That was to fill a need for the blues player that wanted a high-powered amp the size of an Astroverb, but with more headroom and the ability to have a boostable lead channel, which is what we did. And I thought that was a brilliant product. Right. So, and now time just keeps marching on, and now here we are in 2014, and we're still rocking it out.
Anything new coming up you want to, without letting the cat out of the bag, kind of thing you're working on?
Well, I'm working on a new amp as a platform for pedals. It's going to be a 100-watt head, and it's going to be clean as a whistle. So it's basically a power amp with a set of tone controls in it. Okay. And the idea here is there's such an interest now in boutique pedals, and there are so many amazing boutique pedals out there that I want to provide an amplifier that you simply plug in your pedal board, crank it up. It's got tons of headroom. It'll still have a master so that when you do want to drive the preamp using your pedals, you can still, bring the volume down if you're recording or working at home. But basically, I want to provide a really rugged, dependable, clean amp with a lot of headroom and purity of tone. No frills, no gimmicks, nothing to get in the way of the signal. Cool. And it'll also have a depth control so that if you're doing some really heavy stuff, you can still do all the stuff that having an amp that can just chug in the bottom will be able to do. And so I don't have a name for it yet, and it's probably still a good 6 months out there. But that's my next product. It's going to be 100-watt pedal platform. And I've already built some of these for Prince and for his guitarist Donna, and they're loving them from what I hear. So I think I'm on the right track with this one.
That sounds great.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, that's great, Mikey. And that's a great interview. That gives me a lot of insight that I really wasn't aware of. Some things that I wasn't aware of. And the one thing I think that we can tell anybody that's a potential customer is Soldano is all about custom amplification. Okay? Bottom line is, if you want it,
Soldano Custom Amplification.
That's right. If you want it, it can probably be done if it's reasonable. It's going to cost. Like anything, you get what you pay for, and it's going to take a little time. So, and the best place to get that's Blues City Music, because that's what we specialize in. You know, if you want custom stuff, we're going to put it together. We've put together some pretty bizarre things, and we're not talking about flooded eBay items. We're talking about keepers that guys have decided this is exactly what I wanted, and it's doing what I need. So that class and category of device, whatever it is, amplifier, preamp, pedal, what have you, they move on to something else, whether they want to move into more of a vintage feel, more of a recording amp, anything like that. So that's definitely what you want to do. You come to Blue City for that. So bottom line, guys, like Mikey's always said, going 11 since 1987. Nothing's changed. Nothing's going to change. And we just need to get products out there. Once you get your hands on it, you're going to find out, I should have done this a long time ago. And here's the one thing that I will tell you, okay? There's those people that have and those who will. I get calls every week about guys crying about selling SLOs. If you've got an SLO, keep it.
That's right.
Okay?
I've sold many multiples of SLOs to the same owner.
Exactly.
They sold
Exactly.
Them, call me a few years later. Oh, I wish I had sold that.
That's right. And how much is that amp now? Yeah.
Exactly.
That's right. So nothing's changed on anything. The quality is still there. It's made right here in Seattle. Nothing's getting farmed out anywhere, guys. Anyway, other than that, thanks for stopping by. And Mikey, thank you again for the interview and the insight.
Thanks for coming up here.
Always a pleasure, my brother. Always a pleasure.
Yeah.
Blue City Music, 901-485-8250. Catch us on the web, www.bluescitymusic.com. Twitter, Facebook. We'll hook a brother up. So give us a call. Thank you. Bye now.